Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
And February comes around so soon. It only seems like a blink of an eye since last year we were going over the council budget for another year. And if you remember last year, harmony broke out everywhere with everyone agreeing and holding hands and singing at the end. So Tuesday was the big day, Simon, and our chance to review the cut and thrust of the chamber and whether harmony broke out all over or whether there was a little bit more spice to the debate.
Well, there was an outbreak of agreement, but it wasn't universal. Is possibly the teaser that I could provide. So yeah, it's been a busy week in politics. We've had a couple of by-elections up country, which either have gone really well or not very well, or as expected, depending on how you view them. But the big thing locally, of course, was the budget meeting. Yeah. What do you want to take any bets as to how it went?
Well, the first thing I would like to put, and I think I called this early, that I thought the rise would be 4.99%. Which it's not the riskiest bet anybody's ever placed. So the rules are there's a 2% precept for adult social care, and then you can stick up to, if you go to 3%, then you have to have a referenda for the good people of Portsmouth to decide whether they want to bear that cost, or if it's 2.99%, taking your overall tax budget up to 4.99, then it can go through if all the parties agree, or enough of the parties agree to get it passed. Because for people who may be listening for the first time, Portsmouth is a unitary authority, but in no overall control, with the Lib Dems being massive, but not quite big enough to be half. And then a couple of three sort of chunkier parties, but really, as if one of those goes with the Lib Dems, then their budget would have been passed.
Yeah, that's essentially it is. Sorry, I was just chuckling under the idea of the Lib Dem massive.
Yes, they have quite a boss crew, I understand.
Baseball caps and t-shirts are available from the merchandise stall outside.
Well, indeed, yes.
So, so quickly to mention it, and we touched on it last week in our preview. The motion about second homes. So this was the thing where from the 1st of April next year, the council will be charging 100% council tax premium for second homes in this city, but also a 100% premium for homes that. Sorry, your cat has just.
Yes, Enid Blyton has come to join the podcast. For those of you who are just listening, it's Enid sometimes shows herself, and not in the best light, but hopefully there won't be too much cat's bum face related to
we hope
the
not.
meeting.
No, we hope not. Let's leave all the embarrassing stuff in the chamber. So and for charging empty, substantially unfurnished homes that have been empty for basically a year or more. There's a sliding scale of going through how many years, and basically the extra 100% that they'd be charged premium on top. Essentially, all of those things, trying, I guess, to either bring more money into the council coffers, or to free up more currently empty homes in the city, so that they can fill the desperate housing need that we've got. To be fair, that went without really any much of a fanfare, and that one passed without a recorded vote. But it did look like there was one abstention, but we don't know who, because we didn't do like a roll call on this count, which we did on the other two. They're required to do an actual roll call. But basically that way, that no one seemed to be in any real, or no large number of people seem to be in a real rush to disagree with that. So off that went, and then we were up for the main item.
Just one got a last little addendum that I read in the week is that the Isle of Wight, where you think people may well have holiday homes,
Mhm.
they went really big on it in their budget meeting. They've gone for 200% premium, which they think will raise them £5 million, which with a much smaller budget than Portsmouth, they really have gone bonkers on that one. So yeah, we thought that one would pass. Let's let's jump into the main event.
Yeah. So, Councillor Steve Pitt, the leader of Portsmouth City Council, it's his first budget speech. So shall we have some excerpts from his speech?
Yeah, let's see what he's got to say.
Councils of all political colours have been making a very strong case to government that without significant additional funding, the very nature of local government as we know it is in peril. The LGA identified the need for an additional £4 billion this coming year, not to increase the delivery of local services, but to maintain current levels and provide for the relentless increase in need for demand-led services such as adults and children's services and temporary accommodation. The government's response was to provide £600 million, of which £500 million was to be spread across councils which provide additional resources for social care. For Portsmouth, this meant around £1.8 million in additional funding against a budget pressure of £14.5 million, only 7.9 of which was to be covered by additional grants and the 2% precept on council tax bills for local residents. The current system is failing. It is failing across the country. 1 in 5 councils have been warning that they will need to consider filing a Section 114 notice during the next financial year. It's worth reflecting for a moment on what Section 114 actually means. Commissioners are sent in by the government to run the council. Every single non-statutory spend is put on hold and decisions are made away from the political leadership on what gets spent. In practice, this means that events programmes vanish, museums close, libraries close, early help and intervention work in social care, often the very activities which reduce the acute demand which costs the most, ceases. Green initiatives would end. Support for cultural organisations would cease. Now, currently, Portsmouth is not in that place. We've invested wisely as a council over the years, delivered on budget savings measures rather than relying on the extensive use of reserves to avoid making the tough decisions, and this has served us well. However, since the austerity period began, Portsmouth's lost over £100 million a year in funding, and so every year making the required savings without cutting services gets harder as demand-led service costs continue to increase. It is worth noting, for example, that a complex placement in the private sector for a single young person in our corporate care prior to the pandemic cost around £7,000 per week. There are examples of such cases now costing £47,000 per week. Yes, per week. That's £2.4 million per year for one child. It shouldn't need any explanation that 1 or 2 more young people requiring this level of care would significantly unbalance our budget. So Portsmouth is for now a stable council with a balanced structural budget for the next 3 years. This is based on requiring £1 million a year in savings in each of the next 3 years, with a possible variance of up to 1.67 million in addition per year. Therefore, it is vital that we consider the potential need for up to £2.67 million in savings when we make the important decision around raising council tax. We absolutely understand the pressures on household budgets. We recognise that many families have had to abandon their own discretionary spends, the day out as a family, the trip to the cinema, or even just a takeaway meal. But for many, the choices are even harder, with families having to choose between heating and eating. These are tough times, and the very last thing we want to do is increase council tax to add to that burden. However, it is imperative that everyone understands that raising council tax to fill some of the gap being left in our finances is actually the policy of this government. Indeed, when the government talks about increasing core spending for councils, they are factoring into their figures a 2.99% increase in council tax and for upper tier authorities a 2% increase in the social care precept. They are passing the buck onto local taxpayers to shield themselves from taking the flak. It is totally disingenuous and cynical, and I would urge the next government to be more open and transparent about the way they choose to fund local government. If the Conservatives want a low tax and low spend country, then they need to fix what's broken first, before pursuing ideology at the expense of reality. Cutting taxes whilst forcing cuts to the very services that our residents rely on is not good government. It's bad government. It's irresponsible government.
So,
Mm.
so council leader Steve Pitt, they're making it clear where he feels kind of the blame lies in actually those continual rising costs and decisions made by central government, and on reflection that actually, thankfully, Portsmouth City Council, despite having to raise council tax again this year by a total of 4.9%, is actually still in a better situation than lots of other councils.
Yeah, and I think that's where, you know, and again, the bit at the end, anyone might think there's a general election coming this year, and I'm sure that's a theme that will pop up again throughout our podcast. But I think we do have to acknowledge that, you know, over the last the council has been in no overall control for as long as anyone can remember, and you know there is an element of the realities of the cuts to central government spending. You know that is the reality of what's happened. Now, if we look at our council as a whole, they have made the right prudent decisions, which means we are not in the deep hole that Steve describes, you know, of having to effectively hand over control and say, well, we're sorry, we're broke. Someone else is going to have to look after it. So I do think we have to give a positive acknowledgement there. I think the thing for me, which is which is the challenging bit, and I think Steve highlighted it perfectly, is about the discretionary spend. And I think that's where the sort of challenge will always come, because I think for some people there will always be that sort of dilemma of, you know, well, we'll have to close museums and close libraries. And I'm sure there will be a number of people who will say, well, good, I haven't been to a museum or a library in the last 30 years. So it's nice that you're keeping them open, but I don't want you to spend my council tax on them. And I think that's where that challenge in terms of the discretionary spend, I think, is where, you know, where, if you like, the ideological battle kind of might sit.
Yeah, I guess kind of overall, as money from central government has been going down over the last 14 years.
Yep.
The costs of the things that the council is mandated to provide have gone up.
Yep.
Not just because they're more expensive to deliver per head, if you like, but also because you know, some of them there's actually
Just more of them.
you know, an increase in the size or the number of people that need that sort of support. So they're kind of being hit at kind of both levels. And one thing that, you know, national government is saying, you must be delivering this. But on the other hand, but you're going to have to keep doing it with less and less and less. And I guess it's an argument that's kind of made elsewhere by other contributors that you know, that there comes a point where the savings that you try to find, you're fighting ever harder to find ever smaller savings because all of the easy ones have already been picked off.
Yeah, and I think that is pretty much where we are. Is that the size of that discretionary, you know, the size of the mandatory pie gets bigger and bigger and takes a bigger chunk of the resource, and the amount of discretionary money that's left gets smaller and smaller. You know, and it's that question, and that's where I think the question around this whole debate, and we'll get into some more clips in a minute, is, you know, do you always increase? Do you, you know? And I think Steve did spell it out there. Is the fact that, you know, the expectation is that you're going to take the extra 5% and cut. It's not an either or. It's not a case of, you know, well, you know, you don't need the 5%. So, you know, if you cut enough, then you can say, oh, well, council tax can stay flat. I think where we're at the moment is, it appears to be that the mindset, and we'll explore other angles, is that you have to make the 5% increase and then trim the budget to get it all to fit.
Yeah, it seems like they're having to do both things, aren't they? They're still having to find savings, but they're still having to ask the locals to pay ever more, essentially to cover that deficit, that distance between the money that's coming in from central government and the increase of the costs in the things that council's providing. But so just to cue viewers up on how the meeting kind of was formulated. So the council leader of the administration has put forward his case. So he put forward his case, and then the next thing that we heard was a speech from the leader of the Conservative group, the next largest group on the council, which is Simon Bosher. So I've got an excerpt here of his amendment, but let me just kind of quickly look at the actual amendment that he had actually proposed, which was just to sorry, I'm just making sure I've got the right one. So it was to reductions in the housing and tackling homeless portfolio, which was kind of the centre of actually quite an impassioned conversation later on. But essentially, that's about not relocating an existing hub that's in the budget, and also the resources portfolio, reducing that spend by about 95,000, and instead using that money to put in. Oh, sorry, wrong one. To put in some additional spend in transport portfolio, for example, automatic number plate recognition cameras outside schools to enforce the no stopping rule. I can just hear all of the people on Facebook going wild about that, accusing the council of using that as a cash cow to fund apparently a war on cars. So it's interesting to see that as an amendment from the Conservative group. Road safety measures in Copner and in Hilsey, and pavement or path repairs, and culture, leisure and economic development portfolio, adding an adventure play park in Farlington, and public realm improvements in Cosham High Street. So a couple of things there across several different wards in the north of the city, and that was a bit of Simon's speech. So if I can kind of come to Simon Bosher's speech, we'll let him speak.
Lord Mayor, a 4.99% increase in council tax is not what we would need, and as a Conservative group, this is not what we would have done. However, with the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and other pressures, and the requirements to spend an additional £14.5 million in children's services and adult social care, we face difficult times. The budgetary pressures that have been outlined by the Section 151 officer have deemed that increase necessary. But I'm looking to the leader and his cabinet to take note of the pressures being placed on our communities and to ensure that we have tight financial controls in the coming financial year. As the leader has already mentioned, 380,000 for early years demand, 7.5 million for secondary and special school places, both of which, as he's pointed out, are government money passported directly to PCC, for which I would acknowledge the role that Penny Mordaunt has played in securing this funding. Indeed, Penny has been instrumental in a number of grants for Portsmouth from the Youth Investment Fund, 11,500 for Hilsey and Wimmering Centre, which I gather Councillor Madgwick is completely supportive of, 18,000 for the 70th Portsmouth Scout Group, and 1.4 million for King George V playing fields, being 3 examples. And since Penny's Dental Summit, we now have 3 new dental practices in the north of the city. In Penny, we have an MP who delivers for Portsmouth, doesn't write letters. Outside court improvements and play area improvements. Of the £920,000, almost 50% of that is being spent on Bransbury Park. And well over 60% of these budgets being spent in the south of the city. Local elections on the horizon, perhaps? We've not even got to Bransbury Leisure Centre yet, Lord Mayor. But Bransbury Leisure Centre, Lord Mayor, this project has now risen from 16 million to 22 million, and we're now hearing that the sports hall facility is being taken out of that. Hopefully now, though, we have a fully funded scheme. But so far, the cost of this scheme has eclipsed the total cost of the Mountbatten Centre redevelopment, with its 50-metre pool, gym facilities, splash pool, cafeteria, changing facilities, by several million, and to date, not a shovel in the ground. Within the housing and homelessness, the administration is seeking to create a central hub and reception facilities to the tune of £352,000. This is a £352,000 concept. It's not fully costed, and is the estimated capital for a fit-out space, I understand, within the civic offices, most likely on the ground floor. In my lifetime on the Council, Lord Mayor, the ground floor has been fitted out at least 4 times, to my knowledge. But unfortunately, Lord Mayor, this Lib Dem administration has form when it comes to schemes not fully costed. This year, we have Bransbury Park Leisure Centre, the new ground floor reception facilities. Last year, we had £500,000 for the purchase of Farlington playing fields, which weren't actually Farlington playing fields and wasn't successful, not even close. And then who can forget the St James Hospital pantomime? Moving on to resources now, Lord Mayor, and this one is a classic. £472,800 allocated for the civic office downsizing scheme, and the clue here is in the description, a review into downsizing the civic offices. So what this £472,000 is actually for is to carry out a review and come up with a study. For our part, Lord Mayor, we've looked to support our local communities, particularly those in the often overlooked areas, Copner, Hilsey, Drayton and Farlington and Cossam, which have traditionally been ignored by the Lib Dem administration in the scramble for votes in Southsea. We've held public meetings, we've listened to residents who are fearful of speeding traffic in Copner and Hilsey. Those residents want safer streets, not £500,000 worth of studies and reviews. So we've looked to put money into those communities to meet with their concerns at a local level.
This year's budget can be summed up in 5 words. Pay more but get less. Council tax is set to rise again.
Yeah, sorry. Should we carry on and listen to all the group leaders, or did you want to pause after Simon?
Well, I think there's some interesting points there to look at in terms of because it is interesting. First of all, let's look at some politicking. I think there might be a general election this year, so big shout out to Penny Mordaunt from Simon, and understandably so. But one of the key things for me in that, Simon, was it was interesting that on social media afterwards that the cut to homeless services was being played quite loud by a couple of members of the administration, whereas in fact what they were actually proposing was not spending money refurbishing the ground floor of the civic offices, and then noted that there was also £500,000 best part of being put aside to decide whether we want to downsize the civic offices. So for me, there is an element there of that looks like the best part of £1 million, or 800,000. That there's a question mark against that and a ring round that spend. So yeah, whilst there is politicking in all of this, And of course, everyone will pick out the morsels that best suit their argument. That did look to me like £1 million we probably shouldn't be spending.
I must admit, I can't quite understand why you'd spend a load of money looking at refurbishing the ground floor of a building. You're also doing a study on whether you might actually abandon it. But that's just me. I guess it depends. Sometimes that's necessary because other places are so unsuitable that you have to kind of basically just swallow that cost because the alternative is that much unbearable. And to be fair, your point about that is actually something raised by PCI group leader Cal Corkery later on. But I unfortunately we didn't have time to fit his clip in as well. So it's and again, I'll repeat that all of the group leader clips, I'll be sharing the links to their full unedited speeches into the chat, so please do go listen to them after the show, or listen and come back. But yeah, so there is a kind of question there, but you can also see about I think an argument's being made there about a geographic focus
North,
of
yes.
a north-south divide, or trying to make the case is that all of the attention's in Southsea, and that around 50-60% of the money being spent in the south of the city. Well, depending on what you define as the south of the city and whether you're talking about constituency boundaries, then about 60% of the population are in the south of the city. So you could, but I guess you can make statistics make any argument, can't you?
Well, there is an old saying that 78.3% of all statistics are made up, including this one. So should we have a listen to Charlotte, the Labour group leader, and see whether she's any happier?
Yes. And her speech, the Lord Mayor points out that that's her return to full council after being off with the birth of her first child. So let's listen to Labour group leader Charlotte Gerarda's speech.
Putting even more pressure on working people, but residents won't be getting more. The proposed increase of 4.99% will simply help the authority keep its head above water. It will help with keeping up with rising demands on social services, schools and homelessness services. Meanwhile, the council needs to make cuts of £2 million to balance the budget, making this yet another challenging year financially for Portsmouth. The cost of living crisis and inflation are two of the main drivers of the increased pressure on frontline services. The more financial pressures on families means more chances they'll no longer be able to afford their rent, mortgage or bills. It puts residents at increased risk of homelessness, family breakdown and illness. This creates a double whammy for the council, with more demand for council services when inflation is already pushing up the council's ongoing costs. There's currently so much suffering in our city, and yet it's needless because the cost of living crisis is largely man-made and avoidable. Responsibility for this sits squarely with this outdated Conservative government, which insists on clinging on to power, when what the public really want is a general election now, so they can vote with their feet and put the Conservatives where they belong, in the past. While wider global forces have contributed to the economic challenges we face as a country, it was exacerbated by the fallout of the disastrous Truss mini-budget in 2022. Conservative economic mismanagement has so much to answer for, especially for our residents here in Portsmouth. That's why another increase to council tax is going to be another blow for residents. And while the Conservatives will have you believe they're a party of tax cuts, they're actually a government overseeing considerable tax rises. New analysis by Labour reveals the council tax bill is set to top £57 billion under the Conservatives. That's more than double than under the last Labour government. Isn't it ironic that the government is forcing councils to raise council tax while they talk about plans to reduce tax in the forthcoming budget? As outlined in the budget report, since 2011-12, the council will have made £108 million in savings. This is 49% of its controllable spend. This is eye-watering and just illustrates the chronic underfunding councils like ours have experienced. Looking forward to the Portsmouth City Council budget today, the leader of the council was willing to consider Labour's policy proposals. £100,000 more for road safety measures, £16,000 to extend the Portsmouth Stroke Recovery Service until the end of the financial year, and double the number of deployable CCTV cameras. I'm pleased to say the Leader of the Council agreed to accept these ideas, and I thank him for including them in the budget today. We do have an amendment that we were ready to propose from the floor if the Leader didn't stick to his word, but he did. So I'm pleased to say we don't, we don't need to put it forward.
The council is stuck between a rock and a hard place, as always, with finances. Nothing's going to be perfect.
Sorry, missing my cues. So before we get into Portsmouth Independence Party Group Leader George Madrick, so yeah, there is a bit of a theme, isn't there, of throwing to national the impacts there, or the root causes of what's happening behind.
Yeah, I mean, I found that a very funny, not funny, ha-ha, but a very peculiar speech. Because there was this sort of terrible, there was a kind of whole, suffering, people, cost of living crisis, people can't bear an increase. But from what I can work out, there was an element of, well, we got what we wanted for our leaflet fodder, so we're just going to smile and wave it through. So I see this. I think this is and I got into a little bit of spat with the Portsmouth Labour Facebook group because about this time they start posting these, aren't the Lib Dems awful, aren't the Lib Dems terrible, the Lib Dems are a terrible, terrible thing, Portsmouth deserves better. And then, as we've just seen in that speech, they are united with them in deciding that the root of all evil is Conservative central government, and so the good people of Portsmouth can wear a 4.99% shrug. What are we supposed to do about it? Thanks for the extra money in the pot for our schemes, which we will now furiously write leaflets about how we've won for the people of Portsmouth.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess I mean part of that is a factor of how first past the post means that you kind of you have to kind of find accommodations, but then also fight to differentiate yourself from even from parties or policies that you, or particular parties from, particular policies from certain parties that you may or may well not support. I guess the interesting thing is, quite often has been a theme over previous years has been, if you don't allow the budget to pass, then what happens? Chaos ensues. So it's kind of like it's almost, there's a political and metaphorical, gun to the head, but in the sense of, look, if actually the budget got voted down and everyone and you had to go back to the drawing board, what would happen then? What issues would that cause for local services? Does that start encroaching on, if you're having to hurriedly recalculate all of that, bearing in mind that I think these discussions kind of start November, December? Does that start getting into purdah ahead of the local elections? And it's all just a bit of a chaos. But yeah, there's a lot of leaflet writing in these speeches, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, look, I don't mind, because it's politics, isn't it? So there is an element of, if you look at it, both at a local level, the Lib Dems and Labour appear to be ideologically aligned, which is that we have to raise it by 4.99. We don't want to. Central government's fault. And we'll spend the money as wisely as we can. So I kind of get that. I think the bit where I'm sort of struggling a little bit is that, and maybe this is just a political point for another show, which is, that's okay. But it's the phony war that exhausts me, where you tell social media how terrible the Lib Dems are and how dreadful they are. And I don't mind a bit of that. But if you then vote for everything they put forward, it's a bit doublespeak for me. But let's have a listen to see what George has got to say about the whole thing.
So I did clip the bit out where George pretty much said, I thought we were here to talk about local politics and the local budget, so why the heck are we talking about national politics? Could we not be? But I'll play the rest of an excerpt of everything else that he said.
Including them in the budget today. We do have an
amendment is always with finances. No,
Floor if the leader.
Hang on.
You don't need to put it forward. You don't need to put it forward.
the council is stuck between a rock and a hard place as always with finances. Nothing's going to be perfect, and I really did appreciate last year when all four parties come together and put through a budget. I thought that was a really positive thing, and it seems like we're almost here today as well with a few, and I think that the Tory amendment is reasonable.
So George stuck to his word despite saying I wasn't going to speak at the start of his intervention, which for if you're playing kind of full council bingo, that's kind of one along the top row. Did actually kind of keep to his word. After George, there was also Portsmouth Community Independence leader Cal Corkery talked about the rationale of moving a homeless support facility from one location to another location, and now actually spending another load of money on moving it to another one. Won't that just happen again? And talking about the suitability of certain support places where people go into, there isn't enough room for them to receive advice confidentially and dealing with some of the most stressful kind of parts of their lives in them, and basically those facilities being kind of unsuitable for them. But again, he kind of spoke to the national picture that although he expects things to be better if there were to be a change of government, that they perhaps won't be as good as they could have been.
I mean,
that's not a surprise. I don't think.
No, I don't think so. No, and I think if we focus on what George said there, he's talked a lot of sense. You know, there is, unfortunately, we've covered this before many times on the podcast, the political posturing in the chamber on national issues is great for sound bites, but actually changes nothing. And we've seen that from sort of all three of the previous group leaders. You know, it is a difficult one for me because I think there is it is clear to me that the council chamber is divided, you know, in terms of the Conservatives and everybody else. You know, that seems to come through quite strongly. And I think that, you know, for me, there is this element of when we're talking about consensus politics, it almost feels as if the Labour requests have been baked in, the Conservative ones, and I'm guessing I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, despite George saying that he thought their amendments were reasonable. I would guess they probably didn't get adopted despite their reasonability. And so, you know, everybody's got a bit of something with the exception of the Conservatives, and the vote then proceeded on, I'm guessing.
Well, in Steve Pitt's summation, he kind of still indicates that the door is kind of open to have conversations with the Conservative council group, but he also mentions that actually he's in discussions with Cosham, the other two Cosham councillors, Mary Vallely and Ashgar Shah, about using SIL money to make some improvements to Cosham High Street. And that was kind of the interesting thing, is the choice, and that's a whole other kind of different situation to kind of unravel about. Rather than these being things thought out in the budget, could they not be things that SIL, some of them are, that SIL money is used for, because they're capital spend, which is something that that's actually what SIL can be used for. So there's an interesting kind of conversation. I think there was a bit of, should we say, frustration from some of the further responses, but the next thing that happens was a conversation where Councillor Matthew Atkins from Cosham was asking for a ruling on, because essentially he's only allowed to actually move one amendment, but he was concerned that actually the section 114 officer might rule his motion inadmissible, and therefore, if that's the case, his motion hasn't been moved, and therefore surely he's allowed to put another, because he hasn't actually moved the motion, because it's been struck off before it's actually been put on the table. So a 15-20 minute kind of discussion took place And then while that his amendment was circulated, basically they took a what was meant to be a 5-minute recess, but also turned out to be about 25-minute recess to be able to look at that. But yeah, so and not an entirely unexpected, I think, political hand grenade from Councillor Atkins was a suggestion that essentially, well, he'll explain it, but essentially his suggestion was the council can save a shed load of money by basically abandoning the building of the leisure centre at Brownsbury Park, and therefore actually make a significant reduction of around 13 million, and therefore not need to increase council tax by so much.
Wow.
So
Let's hear what he's got to say.
yes, so let's hear what the man says, and then we can come back.
As I begin, I'll actually briefly summarise what would have been put in the other amendment, which I was not allowed to put, which is, as I said to the council in December, I wished the administration to identify some form of budget where they would avoid raising council tax by the full amount. Of course, they didn't, and have continued to call doing so irresponsible, impossible, and all kinds of other names during the course of this meeting. The fact remains that since 2018, which I think is the relevant date when the Liberal Democrats took control of this council, council tax has increased by nearly 25%. And if the track is followed in this budget of increasing it by 5% every year between now and 2028, it will represent a near 45% increase on the 2018 level of council tax. So that will be a record of 10 years, 45% increase in council tax, and I just simply do not believe that was justified. I have a disagreement with the Chief Finance Officer, to whom I defer, over whether or not this council is actually making savings when the budget is in fact going up. So what I would have done is reduced the inflationary increase that you were making across all portfolios by half.
Councillor Atkins, could you please stick to the amendment that's been tabled?
Well, isn't this my general speech on the budget as well, Lord Mayor? No? No, so I will get another speech apart from this.
You just get 6 minutes to speak
Well,
on your
then I'm
amendment.
speaking on the budget as a whole as part of the budget
Party
debate.
leaders get unlimited time.
Yes, I know.
Making an amendment.
Therefore, this is my budget speech, my whole speech in the budget debate, and I'm contributing to the budget debate.
But you get your 6 minutes to speak on your amendment. That's how it is in the standing
Will I get
orders.
another 6 minutes in the budget debate? No.
believe
Therefore,
so.
I can speak on any matter relating to the budget during this 6 minutes. And by the way, it should not include this interruption, which has been over a minute now.
Carry on.
So, thank you, Lord Mayor. As I say, I would not have made the general fund increase, and I would have reduced the increase we are giving to adult social care by about 1 million and the children's social care by about $500,000. So my point was simply this, that at a time when the residents of Portsmouth are tightening their belt, I don't believe it is right for the council to be fattening its belt. And I understand the inflationary backdrop, I understand the blame my government bears, but as Councillor Madrick said, this is a local budget, and I locally do not believe in 5% council tax increases every year for the next 5 years.
So yeah, so there was a interesting kind of stuff there, I guess, about the. I mean, he said at his beginning about him not being allowed to put in the original amendment. I'm not quite sure what or to whom he was referring with regard to that, but he makes kind of the counterpoint. I mean, he makes his point well, as he often does. That has no one really considered the alternative of not, what you would need to do in order to not increase council tax. And I guess he does go on to say. I mean, I think his amendment is essentially trying to exercise a thought experiment in the sense of this is the sort of thing that you would need to be doing in order to be doing that, and it's not right or fair that you continue to feel that it's I'm
Yeah,
paraphrasing.
no,
Is a thing to kind of keep going back to those increases all the time, and I guess that's the point he's trying to make, is that you should be doing
yeah.
something else.
Yeah, I think it's that ideological point, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's that, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, which is that the Lib Dem and the Labour group seem to ideologically believe that the 4.99 increase is inevitable. So we just take that as a given, and then we add that number onto the budget, and then we work to trim back everything so that it fits inside that number. And I think what Councillor Atkins is offering up there, and you can see some of the tension in that, is the fact that, well, have we actually, have we kicked the tires? Have we poked and prodded at everything to see whether there is a way to avoid the 4.99%? And I think a couple of years ago, I think the Conservatives tabled a motion to sell off a load of land that the
Mhm.
council owns in Havant. And I think in the longer version of Councillor Atkins' speech, he basically says, scrap the Bransbury Park Leisure Centre.
Yeah.
Again, there's a little bit of noise about that, but there is an element of it's a £12 million project. It has been bedeviled by, there are there's lots of noise surrounding it, because effectively it was going to replace Wimbledon Park and the Eastney Pool. Um, there is concern about where it's located, whether there's adequate parking. Um, and I have been a little bit personally involved through my work with the Portsmouth Disability Advisory Group, because I think the scope has had to be looked at 2 or 3 times. And I think in Councillor Bosch's speech, he noted that the sports hall that was part of the original design has now gone, and it is a sort of shrinking facility. And there is an element of political, the politics in it, in that it's being built in Milton, or on the edge of Milton, which is the obviously the ward of Councillor Steve Pitt, Gerald Vernon Jackson, and Kimberly Barrett, all of whom are Lib Dems. But I think you're right in terms of the thought experiment. Councillor Atkins there is throwing it out. I don't, you know, interesting that effectively, have we now got 2 Conservative groups in the chamber, Simon?
I, I mean, to be fair, well, I don't know whether that's appropriate. A couple of things. I mean, in the full version of Steve Pitt's speech, he does talk about the capital expenditure and talk about the arrangements and the costs with relation to projects, including Bransbury Park, and indeed, one of the other things that he mentions is that there's exploration underway of an establishment within the city that's looking to do something that would enable them to replace the facilities at Wimbledon Park, but they're
Yep.
not ready to make an announcement on that, and that would be announced formally sometime in the spring. Given that spring is likely to be bedeviled with Purdah, which means that the council
Yep.
can't make any announcements of that nature, that's likely probably not to be announced until after the locals, is it? So in that respect, there is a kind of plan B with regard to kind of the removal of the sports hall option at Bransbury. I think it's just all of these projects. Not being funny, can anyone remember a project that ever came in on time and under budget? These things always happen. It's just really unfortunate that these projects are happening at a time where interest rates are actually so high and where inflation is actually so high, and that's kind of a pressure. But also, just to return to Councillor Atkins's point, I know it's a bit of a thought experiment, so I don't know how serious he was about actually using that as an example to, because politically, if the administration had considered that, they'd absolutely get hammered by the opposition parties for basically cancelling on something they promised.
Yeah.
All of the all of the vitriol that took place about the closure of the pyramids, despite that costing the council, was it something like 750 grand a year or something?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and the Eastleigh swimming pool is literally unfit for use, and it would cost far too much to actually replace. So all of these kind of things and at a time where heating great big bodies of water is really bloody expensive. In a way, are we actually, is that an unintended benefit that we're not having to fund the heating of a large body of water?
Well, and that,
I, I,
yeah, and
I just think they can't win.
no, and I think you're absolutely right. That if they cancelled it, they get absolutely hammered. And so there is an element of perhaps it's a little bit mischievous in terms of the way that it's phrased, but I think, as you say, as a thought experiment, to say, well, you know, here is a way to, defer charging everybody the 5%.
Hmm.
Um, and this is where it does become a little bit. We take the thought experiment still further, and we'd never want to do the referendum because the cost of it would probably be so expensive. But I do wonder whether, you know, and this is the piece where you can't, you haven't all got a controller where you can vote yes or no. But I do wonder if you put to the entirety of Portsmouth, you can either have the Bransbury Park Leisure Centre and a 4.99% council tax rise, and I don't know how much money it is, or you cannot have the Bransbury Park Leisure Centre and a 2.99% rise. I think I think it'd be 90-10 in favour of no thanks to Bransbury, because I think there's an element of something like Bransbury Park, fabulous facilities for those who are close to it and would use it. But it's one of those facilities where it's a little bit, and when we were talking about museums and libraries at the very start, great things to have. But I guess the question of, if you looked at the total cost of those things versus the number of Portsmouth residents that get real tangible benefit from them, it is a question of, in tough times, would the people vote for that? Don't know.
I don't know that I don't know that I would expect a response that you predicted there, and I think fundamentally part of the issue is that the way that council tax is calculated on values of properties from the 1990s, the last time I think they were kind of redistributed.
Mm.
There isn't kind of anything. You almost actually need to reflect the banding that would be the share of property values as they are now. Since like the 1990s, there've been I mean, crikey, I don't know whether that would have included the development of Port Solent, but since then, obviously, there's been the very expensive properties at Gunwharf, and property prices in some
Mm.
parts of Southsea and indeed in some parts of Drayton and Farlington are very much of a over and above kind of the sorts of the sorts of kind of the medium household that you'd be seeing in the property. So overall, increasing it by 4.9% is kind of the only mechanism that the council really has. But actually,
Mm.
solve it. And to make it a more progressive tax, you actually need to solve the bounding in council tax, or indeed to do something more to tax against the value of property, because you can't squirrel property away um, on a Caribbean island. It's here. You
Mm.
can't kind of you
You can't hide it.
you can't hide it, unless someone's invented a way to cloak them. So should we quickly talk about the votes, and then talk?
Yes. How did it all end?
So the votes went like thus. We had a vote on whether to accept. As you possibly might have expected, the administration declined the opportunity to subsume those two amendments. And the Bowshire amendment, so the official Conservative group amendment, went forward, and that fell. There were 12 votes for, which was the Conservatives and the Pips voted for, and against was 26, which was the Labour and the administration, the Lib Dem administration.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Pip's voting for the Conservative amendment, and the Atkins amendment. So it's not an official Conservative group amendment, obviously, but the Atkins amendment. The only people voting for were Councillor Matthew Atkins and his seconder, Ryan Brent. There were 26 against, which were the Portsmouth Community Independence group, the Lib Dems, and the Labour group. But abstaining, there were 10 abstentions, which were Pip and the Conservative group.
Mm.
So,
Yeah. Interesting.
interesting there. So then the big tamale was voting on the cabinet recommendations, which essentially is the council budget. Because those amendments fell, then that passed 31 for, 7 against, and the only abstention was the Lord Mayor. So again, that was voting for was the Lib Dems and for Labour, and against was the Conservative group. I think in my note I've neglected to put in the Pips voting for, because they must have done for those numbers to work.
Yes, they did.
So yeah, interesting, because unless my memory is cheating me, I thought even in times when the Conservative group didn't particularly like the budget, or indeed in those years where they suggested selling off that piece of land, and these things are only kind of avoiding it this year. You can only sell off a piece of land once. You can only avoid you can only have the cost saving of avoiding doing a 12 million pound construction by avoiding it that year. You could then avoid it another year, I guess, which just kind of starts kicking it down the road. I guess at one point, when do you get to the point of, well, are you ever going to do it, because it's unpalatable to do? But they voted against the cabinet recommendations. I don't think they did that in previous years. I think in other years,
no, they didn't.
They've either abstained or actually they've gone half and half. But again, I think perhaps and I don't know, but perhaps the strategy there and the logic there is we understand that the budget's got to pass. We're just making sure that it's clear that we don't agree with it, and obviously quite clearly the different groups will be making the best in their local election campaigns of, well, we voted against this increase, or etc. etc. So that was how
and I think it, we touched on it earlier. I think it does show that there is quite a clear schism in the chamber now, and possibly with it being a general election year, there is a, I don't think it's entirely polarized, but there is an element there of, if you look at, what we're building up towards, there is an element of Labour and the Lib Dems are not going to support anything with a Conservative badge on it, and for me, the Pips have shown pragmatism there in terms of that. But I think that's just where we are, and as the speeches showed all of us, the three main political parties very much framed their budget position for Portsmouth within that national landscape, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. There was very much that framing. So I think, having listened to several of them over the years, we're kind of getting used to the similarities of what. Well, some things change and some things remain the same, don't they? So the other thing on the agenda was the questions to members, and one I wanted to very, very quickly call out was the question from Hilsey Pip Councillor Russell Simpson, which was essentially asking of Hugh Mason, who we'd had on the show a couple of weeks ago when we did our episode about HMOs. So why doesn't the council do the 5% like Thanet have done? And there was a very short and then a very lengthy response from Councillor Mason. The short answer being, we've never asked for it, but the lengthy explanation explaining that actually in Thanet, what they weren't allowed to do was actually to change their regulation to make it a rule from 10% to 5%. They could put in the 5%, but the 5% essentially only became a guidance instead of actually a rule. So in a weird way, that kind of puts them in a worse situation, which seems bonkers to
Mm.
say. If you ask for a dispensation to be able to say, look, we're and these were the points that Russell Simpson made, we're the most densely populated city outside of London, we're an island city, we should be able to make that case. But the real danger is we actually lose the tool by applying for that. We lose the tool that we've actually got at the moment to limit it in the way that we do. But I did also find that the administration's response I scratched my head a little bit, I must admit, because the argument was, well, if we're in that situation, it will encourage people to be developing them more in the north of the city where the properties are larger, where the parking problems are less because the properties are larger and there's more kind of street space per property. And that would be encouraging more HMOs in the north of the city. And I'm just not quite sure how that's not going to happen anyway.
No, and it always. I mean, I think with the detailed work we did, we saw that the density was all around student land, but that they were starting to spread out from there because people had realised what
Got to saturation point.
well, yeah, they got to saturation point, but also what jolly good money making wheezes they were. So, almost a little bit. Why wouldn't you?
If you could take a large 4-bedroom house in Drayton, for example, and turn that into a 7-9 person multiple occupancy property where you're charging each of them £700 plus a month, it does kind of seem a bit of a
Yeah, I guess the difference is, and that's where you are going to pay. You're going to pay a lot more for a 4-bedroom in Drayton than you are for a 3-bedroom,
It's all about the
in
margin.
St Jude, St Tom's. So your capital return is much bigger. So definitely one we'll pick up again on a future show. So budget over for another year. And so you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Please do remember to like or comment or follow or subscribe, or basically to make sure you get on the notifications of our next show, which will be next week at 6:27 Sunday evening. But you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. Please do join us next week.